I have a question for Naveen. So you mentioned something about the making an offer is also a part of the evaluation process, and mentioned something about the rescinding the offer. So could you elaborate that? Because it seems like that is kind of anti-pattern in the industry. Rescinding an offer could looked at as a negative experience. So what did you do to kind of make it like it's not a completely negative experience, but you explain to the candidate that this is why we're doing this, and maybe explain like how they actually took it.
Yeah, I won't go into like super detailed specifics just for sake of that particular case, but you know, I think, like I said, like I think the offer process says a lot about that particular candidate, and I always look for. There's a lot of indicators that I look for. I look for like, hey, you know, how many self calls does this person need? What are they looking for in terms of that close? Like, what do they care about the most? What are the questions that they're asking? In most of the cases, specifically when we've like rescinded offers, it's because of a negative experience of how they're handling that process, and so either we know that, for example, they're literally just getting our offer to use as leverage for another company, or, you know, the specific case that I named was like, you know, there was a candidate that started to treat our recruiting team completely differently, and was, you know, quite frankly not pleasant to interact with. And I think in those cases, it's much easier to just pull the plug, because if they're treating those people that way, how are they going to work inside the company? And so I think it's a delicate thing of how you handle that, but we try to be, I think, very honest with the candidate and tell them like, look, you know, we just feel like this isn't going to be a great fit at the end of the day, and we try to just be as honest as possible as the reasons of why kind of we're rescinding that offer. And you know, it may look bad, but I think it's the right thing to do for the company and also for that candidate, because it's a two-way. The lesson there is it's just a two-way street. It's not a one-way thing where we should try to sell them. It's also has to be a mutual fit for them.
Great, thank you.
Question. As we're having a small teams trying to hire a lot more engineers, the interview panel members are like pretty limited. So how do you really manage their kind of a stress and fatigue of interviewing like in every day, 4 to 5 interviews, week over week? How does it really impact their decision makings?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's reminiscent of Qualtrics 3 years ago when we were ramping and had a small pool of qualified interviewers that we could draw upon. I mean, ultimately the message is, right, like, hey, this is a really important, highly leveraged activity that you're doing, and as it turns out, all the fatigue that and stress that you're under in terms of like running this business and building new code and supporting our customers is going to be alleviated by finding great people, right? So there's sort of messaging and just really making sure that you reinforce the importance of what they're doing, and tying it into the vision and direction where the company's heading. And then there's just some sort of common sense things that you can do, right? Like, so in our recruiting season, our college recruiting season, we'll limit the number of interviews that a single given person will do in a week. We work with our recruiting team. We've built some tools and a hackathon to sort of automatically schedule interviews, and it takes care to make sure that people aren't booked back to back, for example, and sort of spread it out through the day. So we have some tips and tricks that we do internally with some technology and practices so that we try to limit the total number, and then also make sure that it's not happening, you know, like you're not spending half your day between like, you know, 11 and 3, which is sort of the sacred hours for engineers, recruiting, right? Like, you know, bookend them or spread it across the entire week.
Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you all for your presentations today. I was curious, Eddie, for you with Gusto, I've got a specific question and then another question for the 4 of you. Eddie, with the group offer call, are you making a compensation offer at that point as well? Or do you have an open sort of salary bands that everybody's aware of what salaries certain levels of positions are at?
Yeah, so basically the call starts with the group offer call. So everyone's in there. It's a big celebration. We kind of go around the table, share, you know, one thing about them that we were really excited about. Then after the call, after that part, we actually dismiss those people. They go back. It really only takes like 5-10 minutes of everyone's time. And then who's left in the room is the recruiter and the hiring manager, and they go through the actual offer details together.
Thanks for that clarification. That makes a lot of sense. For the four of you, just curious, have you published your hiring process, and have you found that that's successful at all to, like, as candidates are applying, to just get them up to speed before maybe that first phone call, so they know what the structure is going to be, what the process is going to be, maybe set expectations of the timeline?
I can go first for Pinterest. We try to be as transparent with candidates as possible. We try to tell them what we're going to be asking. We try to prep them and we give them materials actually as well to look at in terms of examples. I don't know. I can't say for every role. I know in certain cases we actually even tell them who they will be meeting with specifically ahead of time. In some cases, just logistically, it's hard to do that. But we try to give the candidate as much information transparently as possible in terms of the process of how they will be evaluated and what we're going to be asking them. For us, we actually did opt to share who the person that they're going to be talking to. So they can look at it. We actually also put their LinkedIn so they can get to look at them and feel a little bit closer to them before they actually do the interview.
Yeah, we do it in a couple ways. So our recruiting teams, as part of the screening process with candidates, will typically give them a heads up about what the interview is going to look like, right? And as we've entered, and we have multiple engineering centers across the globe, when we go into a new market in particular where maybe they don't interview exactly like, the interview on the West Coast of the United States. So it's really important to make sure that as you go into the market, the candidates in that area are sort of, their expectations are set correctly. And then we have a blog, an Eng blog, and I literally reviewed a draft post last week for exactly that, how we interview, and we're going to be putting that up, and that'll be available for North America as well. So, yeah, it's a great idea.
So again, thank you guys for everything today. One thing I've seen as part of the interview process that no one really touched on is reference checks and also back channel checks as well. So I know people who are very much in favor of them, very much against them. Where do you guys come down on that issue, and how much weight do you give to references provided by people versus like any back channel checks that you try to do?
So I'll caveat that. I mainly do references for VPs of engineering or VP level and C-level people. I just dismiss the references they send me, and I do the back channel ones. But that's just me. I probably break every HR rule out there. But I'm curious, actually, to see what you guys do.
So we do reference checks on, I think, all candidates. We talk to the reference that they gave. If possible, and if we have a specific concern, we might try to do a back channel. But I think there's ways to frame the reference questions in a way that even though usually that person is a friend or will speak positively, you can still get some information of areas where you have concerns around. And most of the time nothing comes up in the reference checks, but sometimes you have like kind of a little spidey sense about something that you can kind of try to dig into in the reference checks. The other thing I talked about, getting the personal gifts. So two things on the reference checks. One is it's actually a good opportunity, in my opinion, to get to know a little bit more. One thing I ask is, are there any specific interests, things that they're passionate about? And it actually gives me a clue into what should I get that person if we're getting them a gift. And the other thing is, you want to actually use reference checks to also try to impress that candidate, right? If you have if you're really friendly and you have a good reference call with that person, they actually may back channel to that candidate and say, hey, this person I talked to, who's your hiring manager, who's you're going to report to, he sounds like a pretty cool person. And so that actually might help you on the closing process as well.
Two other things to add to that is I always do reference checks on FaceTime or video call because I find that people will less likely to kind of hide details if you stare at them in the eye.
Guy trick, probably.
Sorry.
Not related at all.
And then the question I always ask, which I wish I'm not sharing right now because it's being recorded, but it's a question about weaknesses. I try to put the reference, the person that I'm calling onto our side. And so I would say to them, so imagine you just joined the board of this company, right? And you're sitting with all the board members, and the candidate's going to start tomorrow. What would you say to the other board members to make sure that candidate is set up for success, right? And so that's the weakness question itself, but it really disarms them. and they go, okay, like let me see, give them latitude to operate, or they're not necessarily good on design, so make sure they have a good design partner. Like they find that they're much more free to talk about the candidate when you phrase it in that sense. Obviously, it's not a software engineer is not going to be on the board of a company, but for me on really key hires, that's a question that I like to say.
Yeah, we don't do them sort of universally. I've never been asked to be a reference for somebody who I would not give a positive reference to, so I similarly sort of tend to discount them. We will selectively do back channels. Seattle's still a reasonably small tech town, and so for the more senior positions where the risk of the hire is much greater, and sort of the blast radius of like a bad hire is larger, then we're pretty diligent about making sure that we're cross-calibrating across a bunch of different data points. But for most entry-level or sort of mid-career software engineers, I feel like we can construct the interview loop carefully enough to like suss out the culture values that we care about, sort of earns trust and ownership and bias fraction, all the things that we value. We specifically ask and target for in interviews, and so we have a debate about that as part of the debrief. And so for borderline candidates, we'll sometimes back channel, but if we have positive signals across the board, then we typically won't bother.
I think for us it's a really effective tool, especially when we're making leadership hires. And one trick that I've used, which is kind of interesting and clever, is before I talk to the candidate in that cell or that cultural interview, I'll actually look on LinkedIn and see who do we know in common. And when I show up to the interview, I'll actually say like, hey, so I noticed that we know Andy in common, and if I asked Andy about your performance at KP, what would he say about you? And I would ask their opinion, and then I would give Andy a call and ask Andy, hey, I just interviewed Sally, and Sally said that you think that she was the top performer in the top 0.5% at KP, and I would get Andy's opinion. And it's a great way to kind of gut check what they're saying versus what somebody else you value would say.
Thank you. Hey, so I heard diversity and inclusion mentioned in 2 of these talks, and I don't want to open a huge can of worms, but I was curious if any of you guys had any practical tips on how to improve diversity in the hiring process?
Yeah, so actually, I will say that Pinterest has been a huge inspiration for Gusto. One of the things that I read when I started getting into learning more about D&I was a post that were coming out of Pinterest and kind of publishing that number, their annual numbers. I think the short answer is that there's no silver bullet to it. There's no one thing that's gonna kind of help you build a more diverse and inclusive team. It just takes a lot of work, and I'll try to share something. I could talk a long time about it, but one thing that when we really committed to it is we were getting a lot of candidates that were not diverse, that were kind of more inbound, and so one thing we committed to for a period of time was actually to focus 100% of our outbound sourcing to underrepresented groups. And I would say that's kind of one very tactical thing that worked for us to kind of help kickstart building a more diverse team. And then frankly, just talking about it, I think there is value in publishing blog posts, publishing your numbers, because 1, it keeps you accountable, and 2, it tells the world that you care about this stuff. And I would say that's another very tactical thing that helped us. But again, there's no do this, and this, and boom, you're going to have a diverse and inclusive team. It just doesn't work like that. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think Pinterest is definitely making significant progress in that space. And, Eddie and I actually did not plan our talks in conjunction, and I was standing there, and when he mentioned diversity, my ears perked up, and I was like, wow, I'm so glad somebody else is talking about it, because sometimes I feel like I'm the only person talking about it. And I think the more people that are actually looking for it, and you all as leaders, if you look at your teams and really try to build your teams in a diverse way, I think it'll just help. For us at Pinterest, the things that I can say are, I think, setting audacious goals, making them public, holds ourselves accountable to them, because at the end of the year, we've got to go out and say, hey, how did we do versus this audacious goal we set? And quite frankly, we obviously want to hit that goal because we've made it public. And so it's a really good incentive, and I think it really aligns the engineering teams, the hiring managers, the recruiting team, all around hitting those numbers. And I shared today some tactics. I'm happy to talk offline too about more tips. I think it's a very nuanced thing, and the only thing I could say is just to keep a maniacal focus on it and try to build it into the team. And I think you'll have success. And I think it's something, like I said, that compounds year over year, and you just have to keep your eye on it.
So I guess my advice is, so I started a program 7 years ago at KP called the KPCB Fellows Program. It's like an intern program for our companies. And in the first year, we had 7% female. This year, we're 50% female. And it took a long time to get there. But one key learning was turning unconscious bias on its head. At around the year 3, I noticed that we had a huge spike in female fellows. I was like, well, what's happening? And I discovered that all the female fellows were at one company, and the hiring manager and recruiter were both female. Right? And I also started thinking to myself, and I asked my wife, like, what do you think of this? She's like, yeah, I just interviewed at a company, and every single person was male. Right? And so a really easy thing is literally just have a female recruiter and have a female on the interview committee. Like, it's just, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but as humans, we're very homogenous is the word, I think, right? Like, we like to hang out with who is similar to us. If you put 10 engineers in a room with 10 other people that are non-engineers, like you leave and you come back, 10 engineers are still talking to each other, right? That's just the reality of it. And so, you know, there's a natural gravitation to people that you're similar to, right? And for us at KP, when we're recruiting to the board, and we have a recruiting firm, and the recruiter's a male, they're going to generate all male candidates. And for us, we have to literally be like, we need to get female candidates, or we need to get diverse candidates to the mix. We have to force them out of this unconscious bias. It's not that they were malicious, but it's unconscious, right? So turn unconscious bias on its own head and use it against itself. And so have female hiring managers, have female recruiters, and you'll just see that naturally kind of spin up. If you have none, then that's a separate issue, right? But if you do have someone, really leverage that as much as you can.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll say that I'll add is it relates to the standardization topic that I discussed. Andy had it exactly right. Like, making sure that everybody in your organization is even just aware of the fact that there's unconscious biases. So we had, the name is escaping me, but the folks from Stanford come up and do training for our entire organization on bias and how it appears in interview processes and how it appears in everyday work interactions. And so we folded that into our training material that we have all of our interviewers go through, and we structure our interviews in such a way that we make sure that there's sort of that viewpoint in the loop and in the debrief so that we're aware of it. And it's something that we actually talk about in the debrief explicitly, like, hey, and you can appeal to authority, right? So you're not attacking the other person, but you're like, we sure we're not talking, we're sure we have selection bias here or something going on. And so you'll hear those conversations in our debriefs pretty frequently. So.
Thank you. Thank you for the insightful talk. I have a question about metrics. So you mentioned the metrics about acceptance rate, the time to get hired. But I'm curious, what changes did you make in your hiring process based on their post-onboarding experience? Let's say you have a increased attrition rate for some reasons, or time of service is changed. Do you analyze something post-onboarding, some kind of metrics that can change your hiring process?
Sorry, so the question was around like I think you mentioned attrition, like with your current engineering team. Yeah, I mean, I think all the hiring is useless if, like, you know, you have candidates who come in, they join the company, and they're like 6 months later, they're like, I need to look for somewhere else, right? And so kind of, I think that's the first thing, and that kind of goes to like my last point on my slides, which is like, you have to make it a great place to work. That's going to help you with closing great candidates, but it's also going to help you with retaining them. And that is something that we track as a company, and also by department, the attrition rate of our team.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've noticed just my time at Pinterest is that when you're smaller, it's a lot harder because you just don't have the size of candidate base, and you're not going through as many interviews, and so it's a little bit harder to like hone down and like be metrics focused. But when you're really scaling and you're hiring hundreds of engineers, I think it's so important to be metrics focused. So for us, every week we have a review where we literally look at every single part of the funnel, and we look at the delta change, we look at the team breakdown, we look at the tenure breakdown of people coming in, we look at acceptance rates versus decline rates, decline reasons. We have a fantastic team within recruiting that's literally just running analytics around our recruiting pipeline. And I think we're at the luxury of doing that at our scale, but I think it's something that you can kind of mimic at a smaller scale, maybe not as detailed, but I think we've seen some really insightful things from it. And the biggest thing, I think, is the ability, if you're monitoring that, to pivot very quickly and know and catch on to things versus like not hiring somebody for 6 months in a given role or a given level and then saying like, hey, it's been a while since like we've interviewed like 100 interviews, but we haven't had somebody. But I think if you're reviewing it week to week, you can really track that more accurately.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Yong Sheng at Pinterest. This is a question actually from LinkedIn. So this guy, Matthew Phillips, and he want to ask you guys, will the speaker make their slides available?
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, sure.
So I want to ask a question. When the company is small versus when the company is large, what are different things you guys are doing in the hiring process?
Yeah, I mean, they're very different. So 3.5 years ago when I joined Qualtrics, I was, asking coding questions in interviews, right? And sort of helping set the bar that we wanted to have at the company and being really actively involved in the recruiting process. I went on recruiting event trips, and so the job was very different back then, and the team was much smaller, and so I was doing a lot more of a hands-on job. So now in my current role, right, where the team is 390, and I think of it more of a system, and like what are the inputs and like what are the outputs, and I try to forecast where the business needs to be in 3 years, and think about net supply in a given geo, and sort of think about the higher level issues that we need to tackle in order to make sure that as an engineering organization we continue to have the resources necessary to fuel the growth in the business. So it's a very different job, and you really sort of you work with the recruiting partners at that level to sort of, hey, should we think about a new location, right? Like, what's our college strategy, and should we expand the pool of colleges that we visit, right? How does the overall benefits package and the compensation bands for the company impact offer accept rate? And so just the sort of the altitude that you have to operate at when you are partnering with a recruiting organization at scale is pretty different.
I could talk about, just because I've seen Pinterest grow from small to larger in size. I think when you're small, the key that I've seen be really successful is in hiring more folks that are a little bit of that growth mindset and generalist, where they can actually wear many different hats, because as the company scales, it's going to be important that they have that flexibility. They can try different things. They can fail. They could pick up and do something else. And I think when you're at a larger company, it's really interesting. I was just having a conversation with a friend that's at Google, and we were talking about computer vision, and I was telling him about the challenges that we're solving here at Pinterest, and we've got like a 10-person computer vision team. And then he proceeded to tell me how, his team at Google was like detecting if cars had flat tires, based on their computer vision. And I was like, holy crap, like that granularity of problem that you're solving there is so specialized, that Google's such a big company that you can afford to do that. But like, if you were to come work here, we're not solving that problem. And so I think it speaks to the testament of like, when you grow and scale, I think specialization becomes much more important. But at an early stage, being more flexible in general, I think is definitely something we looked for.
I would say I do agree with both John and Naveen. So definitely a lot changes as you grow. I would also say that a lot of the stuff that I shared, like that's the stuff we actually did from the beginning. The group offer calls. Our first hire was a friend of mine from college, and we're just excited to give him an offer. And so, myself and the other two co-founders, we're all four of us were friends, and so we just kind of got on the call and be like, yeah, we're really excited for you to join us. And that's kind of stuck. And so there are things that definitely need to scale, and you kind of look at things from a systems perspective. But I would say for a lot of things from a candidate experience point of view, they actually haven't changed at all since we started.
Can I do a quick follow-up question? So when the company is small, can you talk about how do you do effective sourcing? So when the business is small, when you're not, don't have much of fame, people don't know much about you. How do you do sourcing effectively?
So, having been on small teams at Amazon a while back when it wasn't growing at the rate it was in the last 5 years, the analogy I use is a little bit it's the difference between spearfishing and sort of net casting, right? When you're a small team and you have to hire 3, right? You don't need an army of recruiters and sourcers and specialized functions. You can, as a hiring manager, take on that responsibility yourself, and you should take on that responsibility yourself. Craft the message, connect the candidate with the vision where you want to go, understand how that person is going to provide, your team with the expertise and to drive the team forward. So that's sort of how I think about it. Really small teams, you don't, a lot of the at scale framework and machinery you don't need, because as a hiring manager you should just own it and just go do it. And at scale, you start to sort of think about, all right, well, now we have to add 100 engineers. And if you have a pass-through rate, which is 2%, right, from top of funnel to bottom of funnel, that looks like 5,000 people, I think, if I did the math right? So, as it turns out, you need a machine to process that. And so that at some point, I don't know what the point is, it goes from being manageable with a small set of hiring managers to needing machinery and infrastructure and mechanisms. And that's how I would sort of characterize the differences. At scale, it's more like net casting, and at small, it's more like spearfishing.
So a little perspective from the VC side. I think one of the most predictive measures of a company's success is how involved the founder is in recruiting at the early stage. They're spending 70% of their time recruiting. The CEO said to me, he's like, Andy, come look at my calendar. I'm like, why? He's like, let me show you how many interviews I have. I'm like, yeah, that's your job. And he's like, you're right. I'm like, you have to tough it up. You have to spend an inordinate amount of time recruiting, sending personal messages as well too, spearfishing in many ways. There's no shortcut around that. To build a truly great company, you have to spend an inordinate amount of time. And for the founders that for example, if I meet with the founder and they're like, hey, we need to hire this really important hire, I'm like, great, let me help you out. He's like, and he diverts me over to his office manager or a junior level engineer. I'm like, this person doesn't get it, right? And then lo and behold, 2-3 years later, they're in the same spot. The founding team is just so involved in recruiting, and there's really no shortcut around that.
Thank you very much for the talks. They were really helpful. My question is maybe not so much related to recruiting, but so much for the team building. And how do you calibrate the level of seniority that you are targeting when you are recruiting for a team? And how do you know if for the team that you're looking for a very senior engineer versus you're willing to take a more junior person? And how does that evolve as your company size increases?
Whew. How much time do we have? I'll go real quick. We have a mixed blend that we aim for, right, in terms of our organizational makeup, right? So we introduced levels, 2 or 3 years ago, and you can sort of, get comps from other businesses and sort of understand where they're operating at, and you try to manage that, and we do, and that's how you sort of formulate a budget, right? Sort of have this mixed blend for the number of engineers you want at certain levels. You can't have, and you shouldn't have, an engineering team that consists of all principles, and you can't and shouldn't have an engineering team that exists of all people who've been graduated from school for 6 months. We try to make sure that there's, like 30, 40, 30, 40%, 30, 40%, and 20% on a given team of, say, like 10 people, and sort of like we have this mixed blend that we model as part of our processes. The reality, though, is that, you sort of go with the team you have, and you will see as an engineering leader at scale, you will start to see hot spots in your org, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, I need a principal there, stat, right? And so as your recruiting machine is sort of like doing this net casting, and you have candidate flow coming in, what you start to do is they're able to sort of intelligently redirect and get on the phone with some senior candidates and like sort of make sure that you put them in the spots that you need it, right? And that's sort of the approach that I've taken with the last 3 years, is sort of have the mixed blend in mind going into the conversation as you do your budget planning and you're working with the recruiting team, but also just be reactive and make sure that you're keeping abreast of how your business is operating and knowing where you need to put certain talent, because the senior engineers that come in are rare enough that you should probably have a thoughtful point of view about how you're going to apply them.
I would say for us, definitely planning ahead. So I try to, like, in general, try to think about it as like kind of a diamond shape. So I think we want to, we have 6 levels in our engineering team, and so kind of have a good foundation of like mid-level engineers. We love senior engineers. Obviously, they're hard to find, and I think a small population of senior engineers can mentor and can have like nice effects for the whole entire engineering team. And then it kind of also it comes in like phases, because like college recruiting, for example, happens around December of the year, and they join around the fall. And so around the fall, you kind of become a little bit more like junior heavy, and so you spend you plan ahead for that and try to hire a little bit more senior ahead of a bunch of junior engineers joining.
Thank you.
All right, I think that's all the questions, and let's give another round of applause to all the speakers. It's awesome. And if you have more questions, feel free to ask the speakers, and if they're stay. And so if you like the event and you'll learn a lot, so I encourage you to talk to all the speakers, and also Kathleen, who runs the workplace team, and also Devin does all the tech support, to just say thank you. And without all this support, it's impossible for us to get it started. It's awesome. Thanks.